Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm welcoming you out there in the audience, and I'm also welcoming people that are here in Flyleaf Books. If the people in Flyleaf Books could just, even if you don't agree with it, clap your hands so people out there can understand there are people here. This is amazing. Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you all for coming in the virtual world as well. We welcome you in any format you're in, whether you're digital or live. So, my name is Max Orr. I'm the Executive Director for Carolina Public Humanities. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to Humanities in Action for the fall semester 2021. If you don't know what Carolina Public Humanities is, or you haven't heard this spiel live in over a year and a half, I'm going to give it to you now. Carolina Public Humanities is, of course, the public outreach arm for the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's our job and our mission to make sure that scholarship and faculty at UNC and affiliated faculty are brought out to share their knowledge with the world and communities and create these opportunities for dialogue and reflection on important topics. Humanities in Action in particular is a series that is designed to take on contemporary and what we might call hot topics. And so we certainly have one of those here today. Before I get into discussing a couple of programs coming up in the future and introducing our speaker, I do want to let you know about our wonderful K-12 programs that have been continuing throughout COVID and continue. We had our 2 live events this summer before our good old friend Delta came in and changed everything for us. But Carolina K-12 is our wonderful outreach program for teachers throughout the state. So I would encourage you, and I know Paul's doing a great job of dropping some names in there, some links for whatnot, so you can see what we do. We also have a very extensive community college program, in which we're making links with many of the 58 community colleges throughout the state of North Carolina. It's just another way that we can make sure that our mission, again, of encouraging humanistic dialogue and reflection are in as many forms throughout the state as we can reach. Before I begin, too, I want to thank a few people. The Cotton Merker Group at Morgan Stanley have always been a wonderful supporter of our programs, especially our K-12 programs. We'd like to thank the General Alumni Association. If you're not a member, you should sign up. You don't have to be an alum. They've been wonderful partners in promoting and producing our programs. And of course, there are some discounts available for this program and others through the General Alumni Association. And of course, we want to thank the North Caroliniana Society, a wonderful partner of ours in putting on K-12 programs in particular. Of course, Carolina Meadows is also a supporter of ours, and we're thankful for their support. We have a few upcoming programs. This is, I mentioned, the first of the Humanities in Action. Take a look at those all the next Wednesdays. It looks like we have 1 or 2 skips, but from September 22nd all the way through October 27th, we have talks here on Wednesdays at 3:30 on a whole host of important, again, hot topics. Other programs coming up, we want to encourage you to sign up for our Adventures and Ideas Weekend seminars. Our first one is coming up with the esteemed Professor Gerhard Weinberg, who will be talking about the Russian campaign in World War II. If you haven't had a chance to learn from Gerhard Weinberg, he is an absolute force of nature. He's been recognized all over the world for his expertise on World War II, and he's a fan favorite here at Carolina Public Humanities. We have, for those who came here, grab our little sheets here. You'll see we have some other programs coming up, including special events. We have a wonderful Claude Clegg will be talking about his new book on Barack Obama on October 14th right here at Flyleaf Books, and that will be another live/hybrid event. Closer to home, if you're interested in only virtual events, and that's for all of you folks out there and perhaps you folks here as well, on Friday we have another edition of Lunch with Friends and Strangers, and that is our biography program in which we have a nice conversation with UNC faculty about someone famous or maybe not so famous. The strangers could be anyone from Kemal Ataturk to Hazel Scott, but this Friday we are talking with Matt Andrews about someone I'm sure everybody has heard of, Babe Ruth. So check that out. Please go to humanities.unc.edu and look at all of our offerings. I'm forgetting many of these. It's been a long time since I've done this, so I'm not on my game. Thank you. And check that out. And also, please consider if you'd like to help us in our mission, especially for our mission with K-12 teachers and outreach to community colleges, we welcome any donations to Carolina Public Humanities, and I know Paul will be dropping in some links there. Finally, I need to thank Flyleaf Books. Everybody here, there are partners, from Jamie to Maggie to Morella and everyone, past and future and present at Flyleaf Books. We're so thankful for their help in providing this place for us to do this, and also the great partnerships we have. And of course, Paul Bonici. Can we put our hands together for Paul Bonici? Paul Benici has become an expert at what he does, which is making sure that you folks out there, I'm pointing at the camera, can get access to what we do here at Carolina Public Humanities. And of course, Vicki Breeden, the sine qua non, who makes sure that all of logistics for all of our programs. So big round of applause for Vicki as well. Thank you, Vicki and Paul. Let's get to it. It's great to welcome back to Humanities in Action David Schanzer. He's professor of the practice for public policy at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy and the director of the Triangle Center of Terrorism and Homeland Security. He also has connections with UNC and has taught at UNC as well. Professor Schanzer is a member of the Countering Violent Extremism Leadership Forum and has been a research fellow for the National Intelligence Council, where he produced important studies on policing violent extremism and anti-terror lessons of Muslim Americans. He attended Harvard as an undergraduate and received his JD from Harvard Law School, where he also served as editor for the Harvard Law Review. Prior to his academic career, he served as law clerk for the Department of Justice and for the Honorable Norma L. Shapiro at the U.S. District Court for Eastern Pennsylvania. He was a trial attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Division and counsel for Senators William Cohen and Joseph Biden, you might have heard of that senator, and special counsel for the U.S. Department of Defense. He has served as legislative director for Senator Gene Carnahan and then as Democratic staff director for the House Select Committee on Homeland Security. Professor Schanzer is dedicated to informing the public, as evidenced by his numerous articles and pieces on national security and terrorism in peer-reviewed journals and in the popular press. And he's also frequently sought out by the national and local media for commentary. You might know that if you signed up for our Humanities in Action talks, this was not going to be the first talk of the series, but based on a wonderful article on Medium, our plan in Afghanistan was doomed from the start. I hope I didn't give away the spoiler with this, with that title. We had to bring Professor Schanzer back to talk about this because it's very cutting edge, and here we are still dealing with the fallout from that. So it's a real distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Schanzer back to Humanities in Action. Put your hands together, Professor David Schanzer. Boom.
Thank you, Max. How are we doing on volume? We good? Yes? Yes, okay, great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I get tested every week as a Duke professor, and I just got tested on Monday, so I think I'm going to go without the mask, and I think I'm good. I'm not exposing anybody here to anything. Thank you for all wearing your masks. Well, let's get into it. Max said, oh, there we go. Okay. No, it's this one. Okay, it's the bottom one. Okay, so my presentation today, my talk is about U.S. mission in Afghanistan, doomed from the start. So I'm going to try to make an argument that what happened last month, 6 weeks ago, was ultimately inevitable. Mistakes were certainly made along the way, but I think ultimately this was a mission too far that was doomed for the start. And before we begin, it's kind of a hard topic to talk about because, yeah, if it was doomed from the start, do we have this idea that all the people who made sacrifices, changed their lives, of course gave the ultimate sacrifice, did this in vain? And I think that's not the best way to look at it. The soldiers who went there, the contractors, the personnel, we have a much different military than we did in Vietnam. And not that people who served in Vietnam didn't serve honorably, of course, the vast majority did. But in terms of misconduct, atrocities, so much less, so much more disciplined force, all the people who were there were trying to accomplish the mission, trying to accomplish the goals, using all their skills and bravery and making a huge sacrifice to do so. And, way too many did not come back, and a huge amount of loss and sacrifice among allies, contractors, of course, Afghan security forces, Afghan civilians who suffered due to this war, people who were there on a humanitarian mission, journalists. And I just thought we would sit with these numbers for a sec and think about that, before we just dive into a critique of what's transpired over the past 20 years. Okay, so with that, I want to bring us back to the moment in history prior to 9/11. But this is George H.W. Bush in the victorious moment following the Gulf War. And it's too bad it's a little bit fuzzy, but to me, I've used this picture a lot. It's a poignant picture. You have to understand, this is 1991. The Berlin Wall has fallen. The United States is really the sole superpower of the world. We've gained he brought together a huge coalition to achieve important foreign policy success, which was to reverse an aggression by Iraq in Kuwait, and was able to emerge victorious from that, actually with a minimum of losses on the ground in this war, which was quick and extremely decisive. And so this is a moment where he's coming to visit the troops, ironically, the troops in Saudi Arabia, which lead to the grievances that ultimately we'll talk about here. But anyway, the United States is at essentially the pinnacle of its economic hegemonic power around the world, 1991. And its belief in our way of life, our democracy, our democratic principles, our economic system is also at its pinnacle. And the idea that, maybe history has ended and we've settled on the right way to structure societies, the best way, and then it's just a matter of spreading these ideas to the rest of the world. I mean, this is the kind of moment in history that we were at. Here's the son running for president. I pulled up this speech, and so gave a lengthy speech while he was a candidate. This is in 1999, November 1999. He'll win a squeaker of an election a little bit a year later. And he gave this speech on foreign policy at the Reagan Library. And you hear him saying, American foreign policy must have a great and guiding goal: to turn the time of American influence, what I just talked about, into generations of democratic peace. So this speech elaborates on those ideas at great length. So you can see even prior to 9/11, prior to him becoming president, Bush is organizing his ideas and his goals for the presidency here, should he win, become victorious, about the idea of spreading democracy, spreading American liberal principles, belief in free trade, the American capitalist system, which he believes is essential to human freedom, and so on. And this is brought to home at length in this speech. Of course, 9/11 occurs, and 9/11 occurs as, of course, a huge shock and massive tragedy. Bush has only been president for 9 months at this point. And I think it's interesting to look at the difference between the initial, little clicker problems. Okay. So this is Bush's statement at Barksdale Air Force Base, before he's really had a chance to absorb and interact with his staff and think through really anything on the long term. But this is the classic, he issues the classic response to terrorism, which is, we're going to hunt down the perpetrators, we're going to punish those responsible for these cowardly acts, we're going to make sure this never happens again, and so on, which is perfectly reasonable, normal kind of response to terrorist acts. Now, of course, there's never been a terrorist act with the magnitude of 9/11, at least on our shores. So you could understand, why ultimately the whole idea gets fleshed out. But later that day, for the first time, he flies to Nebraska, talks to National Security Council. It's on record. I've had trouble finding it, but I know it's on record that that's when he first responds to it, that this was an act of war. Later that night, he gives a speech to the White House that says that freedom was attacked today. I believe he might say that at Barksdale as well. But ultimately, his ideas get, I'd say, transformed. And when he gives the speech to Congress on the 20th of September. And Bush here articulates a much, much more expansive and different strategy than the one he identified at Barksdale Air Force. Because you could have a strategy that was essentially what I would call a counterterrorism, an aggressive counterterrorism strategy, exclusively designed at attacking, degrading the capabilities of the enemy that perpetrated 9/11. But this isn't what Bush chooses, and this isn't what he advocates. First in his speech, again, this is just excerpts from his speech, but he talks about, he asks a series of questions, and he said, why do they hate us? First he says, who is Al-Qaeda? He explains that, and then he says, why do they hate us? And he says, they hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. These terrorists kill not merely to end lives, but to disrupt and end a way of life. There's some elements of truth. Al-Qaeda was no fan of democracy. They're no fan of freedom of speech and voting and so on. But Bush here really ups the ante. It's not just a group that executed a heinous attack, but he says what's at stake in this conflict is the American way of life. And that if this is not countered in a comprehensive way, American freedoms, American system of governance, our capitalist economic system is in jeopardy. He goes on. What is at stake is not just America's freedom. Okay, I stepped on that one. This is the world's fight. This is civilization's fight. So it's a fight of civilizations. And this is the fight of all who believe in progress, pluralism, tolerance, and freedom. Again, upping the ante and saying that if we want these things, and again, Bush's perspective before becoming president, as I indicated, is that the goal is to spread these ideas of progress, pluralism, democracy, and freedom as the best way to organize society, the most consistent with human dignity, is to spread these ideas around the world. So he's linking his desire to spread democracy with the response to the Al-Qaeda attacks. And one other excerpt, he says, as long as the United States is determined and strong, this will not be an age of terror. This will be an age of liberty here and across the world. Okay, so we're ingraining in September 20th this idea of that our response to 9/11 will be proselytization of his conception of liberty and freedom here and across the world. Freedom and fear are at war, so this war is going to be a war of not the United States just trying to degrade a horrible, terrible, ideologically flawed terrorist organization, but that the systems of ideas are in conflict, at war. The advance of human freedom, the great achievement of our time, and the greatest hope of every time now depends on us. Okay, so the elements of ultimately our strategy is that it's not going to be counterterrorism. It's not going to be a focused counterterrorism campaign. We do counterterrorism, but it's going to be more than that. Is that the idea this movement has to be snuffed, obliterated, and the remedy to the problems that gave rise to terrorism, that the remedy has to be the creation of a democratic system and the spread of democracy to places that it hasn't been, the places from which the terrorists arose. The Middle East, obviously 9/11 hijackers come from the Middle East. And of course, the first destination, Afghanistan, which is where they had safe harbor, they planned the attack, and there's a Islamist regime that runs the country at that point, the Taliban. So off we go. We're going off to Afghanistan. Now again, I believe that a strict counterterrorism campaign would still have led to the use of military force in Afghanistan. I think it was totally legitimate that the United States demanded that the Taliban turn over al-Qaeda and bin Laden. I think the evidence was, of course, indisputable that they were involved and was true. And they chose not to. So the notion that after this attack that we were not going to respond, now maybe the Taliban turns over bin Laden, it ends there. But it didn't. So I think some sort of use of force was inevitable in Afghanistan because we had to dislodge bin Laden from a safe haven where he could continue to plan. He had executed attacks in against the United States, the embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998, and then an attack on the USS Cole, a warship, killing 17 sailors in 2001. So if this, if counterterrorism wasn't used against bin Laden and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, we could have certainly expect more to come. So I think certainly some sort of form. But the idea of a kind of transformational, an intervention that would lead not just to degrading al-Qaeda, but to transform the society into one that would be able to have this transformative effect on all of the grievances and dysfunctions and things like that that gave rise to the al-Qaeda ideas was certainly far grander than what needed to be done. And we were going to do this in a country, Afghanistan, with these characteristics. Number one, it did not even have safe, well-defined, stable borders. So it's a long history, which I will not go into, but this whole border here is with Pakistan is almost non-existent and not even legally under international law agreed to. A country that had been in various stages of civil war with different actors and players, again, I'm not going to go into all the history, since 1973. And it had only become a nation state in 1921, and prior to that had been the area rife with different revolutions, battles, invasions, counter-invasions, and so on throughout its history. Became a nation state in 1921 and really only had unified government from 1933 to 1973. And that's the only time in its history before or after that period that it had any sort of stability. There are 14 major ethnicities. I'm not just saying 14 that are actually mentioned in the national anthem. So this is, and they don't necessarily get along. They don't get along. So this is ethnically incredibly diverse, which is not a bad thing, but a history of being ethnically fractured as well. This country that we were going to spread freedom, democracy, pluralism, tolerance to also ranked 195 out of 195 countries in the world in gross domestic product, which was about $114. I don't know if that was per month or per year, but it's low. And with a literacy rate hovering around 25%. So, in much of the rhetoric about building democracy and bringing freedom and transporting our system, which I believe is the most successful system and the most virtuous system that is possible, there's all this comparison to what we did post-World War II with Germany and Japan. And my only point is that where we were going to try to do this after 9/11 was not Germany, was not Japan. This was a place where this was going to be nigh well impossible. That's why I say doomed from the start. But the challenge was going to be monstrously difficult. Now, I think one of the reasons that we continued to try to, execute this mission, this vision laid out as early as the 20th of September, 19 days after the attack, was because how successful we were in the initial stages of actually defeating the Taliban and booting al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. I mean, this is a war that lasts 2 months and 2 days before the fall of Kandahar. Al-Qaeda is chased up into the mountains on that border area that I pointed out in Tora Bora. Bin Laden is there. The U.S. Rangers are bearing down. But decisions are made to not go after bin Laden more aggressively based on troop levels and risk. Bin Laden and much of the leadership of al-Qaeda at that point escapes over the border into the hinterlands of Afghanistan, where they're able to shelter and gain essentially safety. But it was so easy to achieve that objective that I think the hubris and the confidence in this desire, okay, now we've gotten rid of these guys out of this country, now we're going to make it a place that's going to be, make it safe and transform it into a different kind of society and country. So fast forward 6 years, again, there's a lot of history, but an article is written which I think it could have been written in 2021 and say the exact same things. The Taliban come back. We're losing, by this stage, we're already losing in Afghanistan. After some early progress, the creation of a government, the drafting of a constitution, some elections, it's becoming unsustainable. So why? Numerous answers, all of which were endemic and predictable prior to going. Reason number one really is the Pakistani intelligence services. The Taliban, the Pakistan believed that the Taliban gave them strategic depth against countries that it was much more concerned about than they were extremist groups. Which was essentially India. The Pakistani government did not want a country that could ally with India, the United States, and essentially encircle them, which would succeed if a strong, liberal, democratic government emerges in Pakistan. In Afghanistan. So this border was always porous, and the ISI provided safe harbor, support, money, troops to the Taliban to keep this hedge against what they believed was a much greater threat, which was India. Furthermore, our ability to influence the ISI, now of course Musharraf at this point, who was the president of Pakistan, was like, we're with the US, we're a partner in the war on terror, but the civilian leader, even though Musharraf was former military, but the presidency has always been only a quasi-leader of Pakistan. The ISI has always acted in some ways independently from the civilian government. And they had a different idea about what was in Pakistan's strategic interest. So no matter what we did in Afghanistan, no matter how much troops, no matter how much effort, money, effort to be directed against this problem, you always had the difficulty that the Taliban had a safe harbor in Pakistan. Second, when the Americans came, money flooded into this country, and in this society, which you saw the lack of development and the lack of kind of rule of law traditions of rule of law, financial structures, banks that were accountable, transparency, you name it. Afghanistan didn't have it. So it could come as no surprise of endemic corruption that was, over the entire 20 years, was never even close to solvable. I served in Congress. Max talked about my biography. I served in Congress with a friend named John Sopko. John and I worked together towards the end of my Washington career, and he ultimately went on to become the SIGAR, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. And you can read many of his op-eds, news coverage of the reports. Now, in I don't know how many years he's been at it, maybe almost a decade, you could take this bookcase here and fill them up with reports about how the United States funding and the money that we put in was wasted, subject to massive corruption. We could not solve this problem. So we could not defeat the Taliban because they had a safe harbor in Afghanistan. We could not help construct a government in Afghanistan that was not corrupted, that had legitimacy, that had ultimately the support of the people because of the corruption. Of course, Afghanistan's been called the graveyard of empires, and the reason ultimately is because the one thing that unifies Afghans, not unified by language, not unified by ethnicity, not unified by kind of a sense of nationalism, which really is what gives nation states their staying power, this idea that we have a nation that we're all part of, that we're willing to literally fight for because we have this affinity towards the nation. There is none of that. But what does unify Afghans is hostility to outside invaders. And if you read about all the pre-nation state history of Afghanistan, you quickly understand that this is something, a goal which all Afghans, or not all Afghans, but many Afghans can get behind. And so all the empires that have come have ultimately faced this. And this is, with our American dollars, the project for the new American century, this kind of neoconservative idea that Bush is espousing, that we're going to create a world where American principles and ideals predominate, where they hadn't up to even the post-Cold War period, that we are pushing a very large boulder up a very steep hill. So overcoming this hostility to foreign intervention, the bringing of foreign ideas to try to inculcate them in this very rugged, traditional land of Afghanistan was like trying to push a boulder up a hill. The Karzai government that was put in was certainly more decent and better structured and more effective than the Taliban government that was there from 1996 to 2001. But that doesn't mean it was good, effective, that Karzai was an effective ruler. He had faced a monumental task, but ultimately this government didn't perform well, did not provide services to its populace, did not gain popular support and affinity from the population that is necessary if you're going to fight back an insurgency against foreign invasion, which is what the Taliban was fighting. So it's hard to get people to lay their life on the line and many did. Many Afghans sign up to be in the army and to be in the National Police Force. And we saw the numbers of how many ultimately fought and died. So there were Afghans who were willing to stand up and do that. But even the creation of this army and the creation of the National Security Forces, the National Police, which Afghanistan had never had previously. We were creating these institutions from scratch. And with American training and ingenuity and hand-to-hand work together, yes, you could create a good soldier. You could create a good special forces unit. You might even be able to create a good brigade. But ultimately, when the push comes to shove, do these forces have this kind of institutional capacity to fight for a cause and against a highly nationalistic Taliban fighting against the foreign invader, and also that is imbued with kind of Islamist ideology that, again, many find much more attractive than kind of this Western liberalism that is being espoused by the government. So this is not a government that got people all over the country. They were able to control Kabul but out in the other parts of the country, it was really never able to assert its authority and never able to gain the popular support and will that you would need to fight back against an insurgency. So if the Americans aren't there and NATO's not there with an Afghan government unit and the Taliban comes into town, well, who are the local population going to go with? They're going to go with the people who are holding a gun to their head and so on. They're not going to push back and fight because there's no government that they care about or is providing services to them or they have allegiance to in order to sustain that kind of insurgency. Hold it, a couple more. Okay, and then of course, did I do, okay, bad governance, and then of course there's the Iraq War, which starts in 2003. So literally a year and 2 or 3 months after Kandahar falls and we engage in this giant nation building project in Afghanistan, which is going to test and stretch all of our capacities in order to make it possible, we embark on a large-scale war in Iraq, which drains, of course, the attention of the military resources, and then after Iraq spirals out of control, not long after we topple the Saddam Hussein regime, a massive insurgency develops there that requires, essentially the focused attention of the Bush administration until Bush leaves office in 2009. Iraq becomes the single predominant existential issue for the Bush administration, and it sucks all of the energy out. So Afghanistan was always kind of a second-order issue once Iraq, which is, of course, a much more important, strategically located country that has oil, as opposed to Afghanistan, whose major export crop is poppies and illegal narcotics, and has very little strategic value compared to what's going on in Iraq. So, of course, Afghanistan is priority number 2. Okay. Going to go pretty quickly here, but my view about the Obama years in Afghanistan is that Afghanistan went from the good war. If you recall, Obama runs in 2008 criticizing first Hillary Clinton support for the Iraq war, and then uses that effectively against John McCain as well. And in order to varnish his, kind of, I'm still tough on national security, I can lead this country, is saying, listen, I'm going to fight the good war. I'm a tough guy. I'm not just an anti-war. I'm the tough guy who's going to fight the war against, Islamic terrorism, Islamist terrorism. And so we're going to double down, and we're going to try to, that's where al-Qaeda was. We're going to win the war in Afghanistan, but Iraq was a bad idea. We should have never gone, and I'm going to get us out. So Afghanistan starts as a good war. Almost immediately upon entering office, Obama approved 17,000, I believe the number is, additional troops for Afghanistan. Requests had been sitting on Bush's desk for many months. Because why? Because we were losing the war in Afghanistan. That's why we needed an immediate infusion of 17,000 troops at the beginning of the bomb. Additional requests, Stan McChrystal is made, General McChrystal is made the commanding general in Afghanistan. The idea is to bring the methods that were used in Iraq from 2005 to 2006 that were successful in tamping down the insurgency there, not defeating it, but certainly tamping it down so that the violence was much reduced. He's going to bring his ideas to Afghanistan, and he proposes to the president a much larger scale infusion of troops to essentially run a full-fledged counterinsurgency campaign, because that's at this point what you needed against the Taliban, because it was a large-scale insurgency. And this is where Obama begins to get cold feet. Of course, the Great Recession and the economic recovery is sluggish at best. So this is going to be a very expensive endeavor. And I believe ultimately Obama begins to see, even though he thought it was the good war after a year in office, he's beginning to see the futility of this mission. And he pushes back, and they have lots of meetings, and he's debating with Hillary Clinton, who wanted a strong counterinsurgency. She was with McChrystal. His second-in-command, Joe Biden, saying, don't do it. We should go with just counterterrorism, keep a small force there that can fight against al-Qaeda, but you're not going to win this thing, buddy. This is a task too far. And Obama tries to split the difference. And ultimately does approve a very large troop increase, but he says this is going to be time limited. I'm going to let you see if you can make progress. The idea, we push back at the Taliban really hard, force them to the bargaining table, enter some sort of negotiation, get a kind of consensus government, and then we can have a settlement and the Civil War will end, and so on. That was the theory behind this strategy. But as everybody pointed out, all the critics of Obama, this really showed a lack of commitment. Because if you're going to put a 2-year time limit on the surge in troops, you're showing that you're not really committed to its long-term success. And counterinsurgency takes time and many years of effort for it to be successful. So to me, this was an indication that Obama truly didn't believe in the mission, and ultimately we get to Afghan good enough, which even after the surge ends, Obama keeps wanting to reduce troops, bring people home, get out of this mission, and the Pentagon keeps pushing back. You say, you know, if you do that, Taliban could take over, Kabul could fall. You don't want that happening on your watch, do you, Barack? No, I don't want to have chaos and scenes of U.S. Losing this war, not on my watch. So throughout the rest of the Obama administration, putting enough time, attention, resources to prevent a Taliban takeover, but not really enough to change the situation on the ground and truly defeat the Taliban. So that's what I mean by Afghan good enough. And, you know, I'm generally pretty supportive of the Obama foreign policies, but I have to say in this instance, it seems wrong to send soldiers into battle ultimately for a mission you don't believe in. So I think you have to think about the ethics and the morality and the strategy here of essentially kicking the can down the road, which is really what I believe ultimately was the core strategic objective of the Obama years in Afghanistan. Towards the end, again, at one point Obama says, we're done, we're getting out, and there's pushback, and he changes his mind. He's persuaded by the Pentagon not to do it, and this is the headline, and he's saying this was the right thing to do. Obama backs off the Afghanistan withdrawal plan. Have you ever seen 4 unhappier guys at a press conference? We're looking at the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Obama, and Biden. And Biden's probably thinking to himself, damn, now I'm going to have to do it. although he turns out he doesn't run for the presidency, but he probably maybe thought he might be going to when this picture was taken. So again, this is, I think, the denouement, really, of the Afghan good enough sentiments among Obama. Okay, so then we get Trump, and Trump campaigns against the forever wars. He campaigns against, he truly pummels Jeb Bush for a war that Jeb Bush had nothing to do with, just the fact that he was his brother. And he takes the Republican frontrunner, who had all the establishment support, all the money, all the campaign infrastructure, and in 2 months of pummeling him, principally on his support for, and he didn't even support it, but the Bush legacy on foreign wars, he forces him out of the race before. Well, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, I guess Bush waited till the South Carolina primary, but the guy didn't even get into the double digits, I don't think, in Iowa or New Hampshire. So Trump runs on this, but he gets into office, and his first national security advisor, Mike Flynn, he doesn't really make it out of the first month. And then he gets H.R. McMaster, famous here as a wonderful Tar Heel, as his strategist. It was a strange choice because McMaster and Trump did not see the world the same way at all. But now we're half a year in, and we need an Afghan strategy. And I believe this was the McMaster strategy, that he sells Trump on this idea, hey, you don't want to be against this Afghan war. Just like the generals and all were telling Obama, you don't want Kabul to fall on your watch. We're losing. We need more troops. So it's almost a redux of the beginning of the Obama administration. And Trump goes for it. He says, oh, we're going to be tough on Pakistan. They were never tough on Pakistan. So it was the same conundrum, the same insoluble problems in Afghanistan that Trump faces. He gives a speech where he uses the word win. I counted last night. We're going to win 6 times, and we're going to have victory. That was used 3. So almost 10 wins or victory. And apparently, if you tell him you're going to win and victory, that's good enough for Trump to endorse your policy. That lasted less than a year, where Trump goes back to essentially what his gut feeling is that this is an unwinnable war, and we're going to get out of it. And frankly, his gut was right. Not that necessarily the way he went about it, but his gut was telling him that his heart was not in McMaster's. Oh, and by the way, McMaster's gets fired pretty soon thereafter. So you see him and letting the door hit him on his way out. So McMaster's doesn't last long, and neither does his victory strategy. So what does Trump do? Trump enters into direct negotiations with the Taliban to try to get out. Ultimately, the negotiations last about 1.5 years. McMaster's is gone, and an agreement is reached. And I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on taking a look. And the agreement is signed February 29th, 2020. Okay, so about 1.5 years after negotiations start. Now, who are the negotiations with? The negotiations aren't between the parties of the Civil War. The parties of the Civil War are the Afghan government and the Taliban. This is a negotiation between the United States and the Taliban. And what ultimately it is a negotiation over is the terms upon which the United States is going to withdraw. So it is captioned as a peace plan, but there is ultimately nothing in the agreement to bring about peace, only to discuss the terms upon which the United States is going to leave Afghanistan. So I think looking at parts of this agreement are critical, and I apologize for the small type. But here are the U.S. obligations under the so-called peace deal. The United States agrees to reduce troops from what was in the low 10,000s, maybe as much as 15,000, to 8,600 by July 15th, 2020. We will withdraw our forces from 5 military bases by that same date. All withdrawal of forces by May 31st, 2001. We're going to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners by March 10th, 2020. So that's just shortly after the agreement is signed. And this was made linked to when peace negotiations would start between Afghanistan and the Taliban. It says we're going to start peace negotiations right away, and when that happens, 5,000 prisoners will be released. Problem is that it wasn't the United States did not have custody of these prisoners. These prisoners were not the United States' to release. They were under the custody of the Afghan government. So the United States, and we're there because we say we're going to build this, we're there to support a government that can sustain itself and defend itself against foreign enemies, yet we're undermining its very authority, its core security interest in deciding who is in custody and who should not be. And we essentially stripped the Afghan government of that by saying that we agree, without them being at the table, to release these 5,000 prisoners. We say that all prisoners of the Taliban are going to be released by June 10th. We agree to review sanctions against the Taliban once the negotiations start, but by get rid of U.S. sanctions against the Taliban by the 27th of August. We're going to engage, can't agree, get them, we can't promise, but we engage with the UN Security Council with sanctions against the Taliban. And we're going to refrain from using the threat of force or force against the territorial integrity of Afghanistan, and also seek economic construction for post-settlement government. I mean, this is pretty close to the Taliban's wish list. I don't know what demands they asked for that they didn't get, but it's hard to imagine what they might have been. What does the Taliban agree to under this deal? It says it will prevent its members and other groups like Al-Qaeda. Remember, this is the only time in the agreement that Al-Qaeda is mentioned. This is the exact language, that it's going to prevent its members and other groups like Al-Qaeda from using the soil of Afghanistan to threaten the United States and its allies. Nothing about using violence against the Afghan government, nothing about a ceasefire of any sort, nothing. So we gave away everything, all of our troops, the military bases, the prisoners, economic reconstruction, sanctions, and there's no agreement for them to enter into a ceasefire. Here's my favorite language from the agreement. This is a direct quote. The Taliban agrees to send a clear message that those who pose a threat to the security of the United States and its allies, that's their euphemism for terrorist groups. They won't use the word terrorism or terrorism groups or Al-Qaeda in the agreement, but who pose a threat to the United States, that they have no place in Afghanistan. Wow, what a binding, harsh promise the Taliban has agreed to. We're not going to actually make that happen. We're just going to agree that we'll send a message to our people. Meanwhile, there are Al-Qaeda entities, individuals, personnel who are embedded with all of the military units throughout Afghanistan that are continuing to fight against the Afghan government after this agreement is put into place right up to 2021. The Taliban agreed to instruct its members not to cooperate with groups that threaten the United States. Well, this is an organization that has no internal discipline, that has no ability to control all of its members. It's not a regular, regular armed force. It's essentially an extended militia. They agreed to prevent any group in Afghanistan from threatening the United States. Again, nothing about the Afghan government. Pretty hard for the Taliban to threaten the United States from 3,000 to 4,000 miles away. And they're going to withhold immigration documents to those who threaten. So they're not going to let kind of Taliban or Al-Qaeda who are outside the country to come in and immigrate. Good luck, right? So what happens after the agreement? Basically, the tenuous, light things that the Taliban agrees to do, it violates all of them. Defying Trump's landmark peace deal, the Taliban continue to back al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, the United Nations reports. Okay, so everybody knows that the al-Qaeda is all over the Taliban and in Afghanistan, and the Taliban has done nothing to change after reaching this agreement. To reach a peace deal, the Taliban says the Afghan president must go. Usually you don't make a demand that you have to dismantle the government before you start peace negotiations. The Taliban said they were agreeing to enter into peace negotiations in the agreement, but then they put in the preconditions that the president must leave. So they don't take this requirement seriously. With delay in Afghanistan peace talks, a creeping sense of siege around Kabul, the Taliban shifts to targeted attacks around the capital and neighboring districts. The country's security forces seem unable to control. And this is all in 2020 before Biden has come in. So the peace talks do not really get started until December. And there is a kind of a looming sense that that the government is really unable to control the Taliban at this point. Afghan to release the last Taliban prisoners, removing the final hurdle to talks. The decision clears the way for the last of 5,000 insurgents to be freed. Ghani announced the release after convening an assembly of 3,000 representatives. So this was a hard pill for the Afghan government to swallow, especially the last 400 who were pretty much hardened Taliban killers. But they're desperate to try to get these peace talks started, so ultimately they capitulate to the agreement the United States made, even though we got nothing in the agreement for the Afghan government, which we had been supporting for economically, militarily, and so on, and trying to create for 20 years. Talks with Taliban are making very little progress as militant group gains momentum, says Afghan officials. Why would you try to enter into a peace negotiation to get a quarter of the, half of the pie, when on the ground you continue your war? You're continuing to gain territory, you're being successful. Of course you're not going to negotiate away, because you know that when the U.S. troops finally leave under the agreement, at the end of May 2021, you have won this war. Of course you're not going to make any negotiations, concessions, and indeed they don't. They never make any, so the negotiations are a fig leaf. Now, what does Trump do? What do we do as the Taliban is violating across the board all of the agreements that they make in the treaty in February 2020? What is the United States doing? In August 2020, Trump says we're going to cut troop levels in half by election day. So the agreement told us we had to bring it down to 8,600 by July 15 and down to 0 in May of the following year. But Trump rewards the Taliban for violating every term of the agreement, infiltrating al-Qaeda, not starting negotiation with the Afghan government. Trump rewards them by having the troop levels before Election Day. Of course, this is all about the 2020 presidential election. In October, Trump says, he tweets that we're going to bring all the troops home by Christmas, which the Pentagon says is impossible. Again, rewarding the Taliban for its bad behavior. At this point, it has not even started the peace negotiations. So the idea that we're using this agreement to bring about peace in Afghanistan was a sham, a fig leaf, a lie. And January 2020, this is after he's lost, Trump announces in December that he wants to bring the troop levels down to 2,500. U.S. troop levels had not been that low since 2001, okay? So we're bringing it down to, he brings it down to a bare, minimal presence. And of course, everybody's saying, well, it's all calm in Afghanistan now. We're not losing any casualties. There's not heavy fighting. What would be the problem of leaving the 2,500? Of course, it's not the fighting season. The fighting season gets going in the spring, and we would be ill-equipped to essentially do much of anything with 2,500 troops there. So to my mind, here is the decision that faced President Biden. The war is over. The Taliban has won when the agreement was signed with Trump. And the Afghan government was totally humiliated, degraded, and denuded by the time Biden takes office, as was the army. Who is going to fight when you know that your main benefactor and supporter is headed for the hills? So no wonder the Taliban is winning victories. It doesn't steamroll Afghanistan before the agreement because it doesn't need to. It's going to do that once we leave. So that to my mind, the position Biden was facing was either complete the withdrawal from Afghanistan, knowing that the Taliban would take over. Biden says in July of 2021, when asked, is it inevitable that the Taliban is going to take over? And he answers no, I think, because he has to. If you answer that while you still have thousands of troops there, while you still have your embassy, while you have thousands of contractors, humanitarian workers, or so on, you make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you say, oh yes, the Taliban's going to take over, you're going to get the government to collapse even sooner than it did. I think Ghani would have, moved up his plane reservation to get out of the country from August to July if Biden says, oh yes, it's inevitable that the Taliban's going to take over. But he ultimately says to George Stephanopoulos, yes, the idea that the Taliban was going to take over was baked into the decision. I don't believe that anybody in the Biden administration or Biden himself believed that the Afghan government was going to survive 2, 4, 8 years. I think they hoped and they believed that it was going to last for a little while at least. Otherwise, we would have made plans to get our embassy out of there much earlier. So we could either do that, or the decision was we would have to escalate the war, send in more troops because the troop structure had been decimated by Trump, and we would have had to engage in more direct fighting in order to stave off the Taliban, which had all the momentum, they were gaining territory, and the Afghan army, which we said was 300,000, was essentially dwindling. They were losing 5,000 troops a month to attrition and death in the lead up to Biden coming into office, and only recruiting 300 to 500 troops to replace them. So this was an army that wasn't fighting anymore, that was decimated. So if we were going to somehow turn the tide and get back to a point where we could sustain this government, sustain this army, and get back to Afghan good enough where the Taliban doesn't take over, we would have had to escalate the war, a decision that Biden did not run on. He ran on ending the Afghan war. So it would have been a betrayal of a promise, and we would have essentially we would have had to get much deeper into the Afghan civil war, which Biden had already decided was a mission not worth fighting. So, I think the best thing to say here is the rest is history, and that is my presentation. So thank you very much for listening so carefully.
Thank you. Well, that's loud. Thank you, David, for that wonderful presentation. Depressing though it is absolutely essential that we're re-examine this history. What I'd like to do is I'd like to offer the people in the audience today to ask a question, have you answer that directly. And if anyone does have a question, David, if you would repeat the question.
Sure.
Give folks a chance. Any questions in the room? Go ahead.
I saw a report recently in the Times that Rumsfeld, within a year or so of the invasion of Afghanistan, said that the war was unraveled, which is that we would be there forever. I guess if we're going to be there forever, we can't win the war. We have to stay there and keep. So is that accurate? Was it well known within the Bush administration at that time that we could not win?
You know, I'm
David,
not familiar.
could you summarize the
Yes,
question?
the summary of the question was, did the Bush administration know early on that our goals were unwinnable, that we would never be able to create an Afghan government that was essentially could defend itself against foreign enemies and insurgents? You know, just because Rumsfeld said it, I don't think George Bush, you know, necessarily believed it. I mean, he really believed in this idea, almost with an evangelical fervor, that all people can, you know, deserve to live under freedom and a democratic system of government, and with enough U.S. effort, ingenuity, nation building, and many in the military, you know, would be telling them that we, you know, yeah, with a little more time, a little more effort, a little more resources, yeah, we can build this army. And, you know, the people who are training right next to them, they're saying, hey, this is a good army, they can fight, blah, blah, blah. You know, they say, yeah, you know, we're making progress and so on. I think 3 different presidents were sold a bill of goods on that. And so, you know, maybe Rumsfeld believed that. I'm not sure, you know, the totality of the administration did during the Bush years. But I think it was, again, once you're there and you've built this, or you're starting down this path, if you pull back, you're basically saying, well, I'm going to let the Taliban is going to come back on my watch. And Bush was not going to let that happen. Obama decided that it wasn't going to happen. Trump, you know, would have happened if he had won his second election, but he didn't let it happen before that election. And it was Biden who bit the bullet, I think, and said, I'm going to let it happen on my watch. And so I wrote in this piece that I thought it was a brave decision, and boy, did I get lambasted on social media. How could you possibly call this brave? But I think it's a lot braver than sending troops to a war that you don't think could be won.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
This is more of a statement than a question, but I like your opinion. I like what you presented, but I think in a broader sense, the mistake of the United States foreign policy, from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, is that we've got ourselves involved in civil wars, especially religious civil wars, by taking sides and sending in troops. Our troops and our goal of making democracy work throughout the world is never going to succeed. Now, we may take sides in the sense of fighting material, but anytime we send troops, we're not going to be welcome by either side once the victory is won. So I would like to see an American doctrine that basically says we are not going to send our men and women to fight another country's civil war, particularly one based on religion. And in Afghanistan, it was a religious civil war between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance or the other groups. The Taliban had a religious zeal that the other groups maybe didn't adhere to, and that was their fight. None of the sides, as you pointed out, wanted foreign troops there. And from my understanding, even the Taliban did not appreciate al-Qaeda and the Arabs in their country during their fight against the Soviets, but they accepted them because they were an ally.
Right, we'll get them later.
Yeah. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. There are some counterexamples. I mean, I think you can look at the intervention in the Balkans. Essentially, it was a very deep religious civil war between the Muslim and the Christian. We helped broker a negotiated settlement. We sent troops to keep the peace. Civil war did not spread into Europe as we feared. We engaged in aerial bombings and so on to try to stop one side from fully defeating and conquering the other. So that's an example that comes to mind of a successful intervention, and the peace has been kept and during the ensuing years. So I don't think we can, generally hard and fast statements about what we will or will not or never do. You'll notice, of course, that Obama chooses not to get involved in the Syrian civil war. If we'd had President McCain, I think we would have. Now, horrible consequences ensued. Millions of displaced people, millions of immigrants, Muslim immigrants to Europe, which has created a lot of political destabilization there, especially did in around 2014, 2016. Put a lot of stress on the future of the EU, even. Tested the great Angela Merkel pretty much to her breaking point. So, and of course, it's still not resolved, and you ended up creating a safe haven for ISIS, which was horrific in its own way. So you can look at the Obama decision not to get involved and say maybe that was the right thing to do, but to say that there were no ill consequences, I think would be ignoring history as well. So sometimes these decisions are looking at the worst bad option, the least bad option, and sometimes what you face in foreign policy. But I do agree with you. I don't think U.S. foreign policy is headed for another large-scale invasion of another country to try to bring about democracy there for a long time.
We have more questions in the room. If I could ask for people who ask questions in the room to just keep them relatively brief, because it's complete silence for the people on the other side. So,
okay.
And then,
You said obviously that the Biden didn't, or the administration didn't think the Afghan government would be able to hold for 2, 4, 6 years.
I don't think so.
But this is the question everyone's asking: what should they have known that it wasn't going to hold for more than 2 weeks? I mean, should they? How could they have had it?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, and I don't want to pretend. That's a question about what the intelligence agencies were telling them, what the people on the ground were telling them, and there's been some reporting that while the earlier estimates were that this was an army that would fight and it could hold its own for at least a short run. I mean, there was no, we were planning on keeping our embassy in Kabul, right? So these are not dumb people, that they were, attached to a plan that they knew was not going to work. Who would do that? I'm also not expert in logistics. I don't know, there's a lot of saying, well, why would we give up Bagram Air Force Base? We should have held on to that till the very end. And I don't know why, but those are not decisions. I don't think the president comes out and says, to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I don't think he says, well, let's get out of Bagram first and then we'll just use the Kabul airport. That'll be fine, right? These are decisions I think that the military made about, what made sense from a tactical point of view, not a strategic. The president makes the strategic decisions. We're getting out by this time. And the military says this is the best way to do it. Now, obviously, the situation changed. Who's culpable? Who should have known when? That's always the decision. When did you know, and when should you have known it? And I don't really know the answer to that. I don't think there's a good way to lose a war, and I think this episode certainly proved that.
So what do you think now with Afghanistan and the Taliban?
Yeah.
Is it just going to be a nest against
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda and whatnot?
repeat the question.
Yeah, the question is, what's going to happen in the future of Afghanistan? Is Al-Qaeda going to make a comeback, and so on? The bottom line is, I always like to say, prediction, or Yogi Berra line, that predictions are really hard, especially about the future. Here's my thinking on this. First of all, I'm not a believer in softer, fuzzier Taliban 2.0. I don't think they've changed their ideological commitment. I don't think they've changed their goals. I don't think they, have liberalized and believe in a different way that society should be organized, that women should be able to, wear whatever they want and work wherever they want and believe whatever they want. I don't think the Taliban believes any of that. And they're showing that through many of their appointments and their early actions and so on. But in the end, I try to think about, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe human nature will just take over and they'll just revert and run things exactly the way they did in 1996. and they'll figure out who all their enemies are and bring them into a football stadium and start shooting them. Mass executions, a reign of terror, hunting down religious minorities and slitting their throats. I mean, maybe they'll do that, and maybe that's their nature, and that's what's going to happen. But if you look at what their interests are, why would you fight for 20 years just to rerun history all over again? And there are a couple factors here, that I think are important. Number one, the country is dead broke, right? So everybody says, well, we don't have leverage, we can't do anything, we're not there, blah, blah. The country is dead broken, we're headed for a humanitarian crisis. What countries are going to donate to bail out a government that is, engaged in, large-scale mass human rights violations? What countries are going to give to a government that is essentially letting their country be a base for a launching pad for terrorism against the rest of the world? So there's certainly leverage there. Do I think that the Taliban's going to be decent and nice and democratic and respectful of women? No, I don't think any of those things. And I don't think we can expect that. But does the international community have leverage to force the Taliban to behave not acceptably in our views, but at least not egregiously bad? Maybe. As for Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda's been very, very weakened. There's a very good article in Foreign Affairs this month about, inherent weaknesses in Al-Qaeda. And, yes, are Al-Qaeda personnel with the Taliban in Afghanistan, or some of them maybe entering the government? Yes. But do they have the wherewithal, the organization, and the desire to launch attacks against Western targets? Again, what would be in the Taliban's interest to allow that to happen? I mean, they know that they would be held, deeply accountable. Do they want to rerun? Did they fight for, an insurgency for 20 years to let Al-Qaeda, not them, they have never been a global jihadist movement. I mean, they want to run the emirate of Afghanistan. Are there people who hold some of these ideas? Sure, but the experience between 96 and 2001 doesn't suggest that they themselves harbored those ambitions. I know ISIS-K, and ISIS in Afghanistan certainly does. And the Taliban's fighting against them. ISIS, K says these aren't the real deal. This Taliban, they're like weak. I think it's interesting that government and the Taliban might want to work together to weaken and degrade the ISIS elements, because we see ISIS as being more openly aggressive, hostile to Western interests. And maybe Al-Qaeda has transformed its goals in some ways as to being more interested in gaining territory or gaining predominance in other parts of the other countries. And that's not good. I think we should push back on that in those countries and so on. But I don't think we're going to, and it's not as if the United States is just going to, we're gone and we're going to drop the mantle, that we're going to stop counterterrorism. I certainly believe it's a lot harder when you're not there on the ground. It's harder to gain intelligence. It's harder to execute your attacks. Our intelligence apparently wasn't even so good when we were at the airport still. So the challenges are, pretty hard to do the kind of counterterrorism we were doing when we had tens of thousands of U.S. troops in country. That said, we still have intelligence partners. We still have capabilities. We can still insert ourselves into the country with drones and whatnot. And so it's not as if Al-Qaeda is going to have free reign to plan and plot. We're a lot better at this, and we're a lot more aware than we were 20 years ago. So that's my thinking on that. Ma'am.
What, if any, role does India either want to play
Yeah.
or do
Well, I think this is very interesting about the, oh, I'm sorry, the question was what role would India play in the kind of post-Taliban, the post-Taliban Afghanistan? Let me broaden that question if I might, and then I can speculate about India, because I appeared on Indian TV, kind of the Indian Fox News show, and I'm going to be on there again Friday, so I need to think about this a little bit more as well. I never got so many retweets and stuff like that, because India is a very, very big country. In terms of, so I think we need to think about what have we been doing over the last 20 years in Afghanistan. What we've been doing is making Afghanistan a non-problem for all the other countries in the region, and they contributed virtually nothing to that endeavor. So Russia has a very restive, Muslim, some embedded with some extremist movements on its southern flank. It's not Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan, but it's not far. So it has no desire to have Afghanistan be a hotbed for Islamist terrorism. China, of course, is very worried about the Uyghur population. Again, I think that's mostly about separatism, not about Muslim extremism, but they claim it is. So they have no desire to have a hotbed of radicalization on their doorstep in eastern Afghanistan, western China, that small border that these. India, of course, is very worried about the Kashmir population. They don't want to have Afghanistan be a Sunni extremist. And guess what? Even Iran is certainly worried about that, given that it is a Shia-dominated country. And there's a Shia minority that is worried about being persecuted and causing refugee crisis into Iran. Iran, China, Russia, India, big, powerful countries that have money and armed forces and so on. And now that we're gone, and now that we're not making the world, that part of the world safe for them, they're going to have to step up and figure out what they want. So I think there's a lot of room for both diplomacy that we can play a part in, and for, everybody says, oh, China's going to have greater influence in Afghanistan, and isn't that horrible? Or U.S. role in Central Asia is declining. And I'm like, really? Was this so wonderful? What did we get positive out of this tremendous influence that we had there for 20 years? Bupkis, as far as I'm concerned. China is thrilled that we were there. Now it's their problem. They talk about China trying to extract the minerals and so on from Afghanistan. And okay, great, but now China's worried about those investments because they're not so sure it's a secure place for them to operate, let alone the problems in Pakistan. The other thing about the neighbors is Pakistan. Now, our presence in Afghanistan constrained us from doing much of anything to try to influence Pakistani behavior. We tried, but in the end, every time we tried to get them crack down on this group, allow drone strikes here, don't let these people over the border, deploy your military up on the border so every time we're chasing the Taliban, they can't just come and cross over the border. We're never successful in doing that. Why? Because anytime they push back, they would close the Khyber Pass, and we couldn't supply our troops. The main route for supplying all of our efforts inside Afghanistan was through Pakistan. Well, we're not there anymore. So Pakistan no longer has, a weight over, the ability to leverage us. So we can now have more liberty in what we can do for Pakistan to try to influence their behavior. As far as India, they worry about the Taliban. I don't think they think the Taliban are going to necessarily attack them, but of course they look at everything through the lens of Pakistan, and they see Taliban as Pakistani agents. They see this as a victory for Pakistan and for extremism in general, which they worry about because they have problems both internal in India, and of course there's the whole Kashmir crisis. So yes, they would like an aggressive posture taken, to weaken the Taliban and to keep Pakistan constrained. That's what they want, what they're willing to do to bring that about. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion about this. The so-called Quad is meeting after the General Assembly. This is Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. And the Quad is supposed to be kind of a bulwark against Chinese influence, kind of a new diplomatic group, lingo. We'll see how that works, but I imagine, what the post-war Afghanistan diplomacy and what these countries are willing to do and what they're, how they can work together to achieve those goals will be, certainly a topic of discussion.
Thank you, David. I want to get to some of the questions. We only have a couple minutes left, but luckily many of these can be grouped together. I'm going to start with a question from David Scott and also Richard Shady, essentially about the military-industrial complex in the United States and profiteering, perhaps, over the course of this 20 years, and how much did that influence keep us in this unwinnable war?
Yeah, I'm not a big believer in those kinds of theories. I believe there is a military-industrial complex and that they did profit a lot from this war, but I don't really believe that politicians make their decisions based on the influence of these companies and the campaign contributions that they make and the amount of jobs that they provide. I think our presidents think long and hard about sending people to war. They're the ones that call the widows, the parents, for every single soldier that is killed, or unfortunately probably not all that are injured. We saw the tens of thousands of catastrophic brain injuries and amputations and horrific injuries. So the number of deaths kind of minimizes the level of human suffering. And I just don't believe that they make decisions about war and peace based on the influence of those companies.
They might have made some money.
I would certainly say these countries, and you know what, they charge a lot of money for doing, to do business in Afghanistan with the safety, the bribes they had to pay to get things done, and so on and so forth. So there's no doubt that they made money, but there are 3,000 of their personnel died in Afghanistan as well. So anyway, that's not the lens through which I look at U.S. foreign policy.
I have two questions from David Scott and Nils Brubaker that also can be sort of wrapped together. David Scott asked, why were the negotiations so terribly inept? And Nils asked, why did the U.S. agree to negotiate with the Taliban and reduce troop levels without the Afghan government participation?
Because Trump didn't care. Trump wanted out. They kept saying it was conditions-based withdrawal. I mean, that's what they come and testify to Congress. They say there's classified annexes that show that we're only going to withdraw our troops. If this happens, if there's evidence of this, there's evidence of that, right? I don't know what those annexes said. Mike Pompeo is up on the Capitol Hill testifying under oath. These are conditions-based withdrawal. All we know is from the facts that none of the conditions were fulfilled, and the troop withdrawals went faster than the agreement required. So Trump believed that this was helpful for his reelection, and we know that that is the only thing Trump cared about. And his gut was that this was a bad war that we shouldn't be fighting as well. So he even took action to reduce troops after he lost, but of course he thought he was going to get put back in before inauguration. But that's bringing us down a rabbit hole I don't want to go down.
We don't want to go down.
But anyway, the negotiations were not inept. The negotiators were taking the instructions from the president about what he wanted. He wanted an agreement to get troops out and end the war essentially after the election, and that's what he got. So I don't think the negotiators were inept.
Let's put our hands together for David Schanzer. Thank you so much, David. Like I said, it's an excellent article, and we put a link to the article for anyone out there.
You've heard it already. You don't.
You've heard it already, exactly. I want to thank you all for coming here. It's really nice to see people in the audience as well. I want to remind folks that Humanities in Action is next week. We have our misperceptions and misinformation and public understanding of science with Brian Southwell from the Research Triangle Institute, basically talking about scientific literacy and its impact on social and cultural life and political life even here in the United States. And a wonderful series of Humanities in Action every Wednesday at 3:30. So please check that out. Friday, we have Lunch with Friends and Strangers with Babe Ruth, a little bit lighter topic. That's all virtual. And of course, on Saturday, if you're interested, come and check out Gerhard Weinberg, full-day Saturday seminar on the Russian invasion in World War II, Operation Barbarossa, if we're being specific, in World War II. Great programs. Go to humanities.unc.edu. Check it out one more time. Come on into camera. Come on into camera a little bit. David Schanzer, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. We'll see everyone next time. Thank you.